Hey guys! So today we're continuing on with our inventory system and we're going to be implementing a way to select our items in the inventory, pick them up, and also stack them. Alright, so in our object inventory's create event, we're going to need to declare a few new variables. And I'll just put it in here. So I'm going to call this selected slot, which is going to be the inventory slot that we're currently selecting. Say if we have the mouse hovered over that spot. And another one called the Pickoff Item. Basically, we're going to set this to -1 to start off with, and that's going to mean we're not picking up any item. But when we do go and pick something up, this number is going to change from -1 to one of the items here that we've set up. So you're going to be holding on to one of these items. Now for the system to work, we're going to need to get the mouse's position on the inventory itself. So we're going to need to convert the mouse's position to an inventory slot. And of course there isn't a built-in variable for this, so we're going to kind of have to make our own one. And that will just correspond to these values and we'll change them in the step event. So let's come into the step event. Actually, before we even do anything, so just like here, how we have don't bother doing any of this drawing stuff if we're not actually showing the inventory at the moment. Remember, we just set up this variable that you can toggle that would show the inventory or hide it. I'm also going to put this in here because we don't need to be detecting or figuring out where our mouse is or what slot we're selecting if we're not actually showing the inventory. Okay, so let's start off by trying to convert our mouse position to the inventory slot. Now, you might have used mouse X and mouse Y, and this gets the position of the mouse in your room. So just like any object in your room has an X and Y position, so does the mouse. But the thing is, we don't want the mouse's X position in the room, we want it relative to the GUI layer. So I'm going to set up two more variables here, mouse X, and so we're going to set this to be the device mouse X to the GUI. So this, if you just middle click on this, so you can see that this returns the position of the mouse relative to the GUI layer. And that's exactly what we want because everything that we're drawing is in the GUI layer. So now if the mouse is hovering over one of our slots in the GUI layer, it should give us the corresponding X value that we actually care about. Okay, and we'll do the same for the mouse Y. Just change that to a Y. All right. So we have the mouse position relative to the GUI layer, but now what we need to do is convert that to a slot. So if you recall, our slots that we're drawing to the screen, so the slots themselves, they have a sprite width of the cell size, right? Which if you're using the sprites that I'm using is just 32. And we're drawing them at a distance apart that is this. So they are one cell size and then one X buffer apart. So we need to break up the mouse's position into increments of this. So we need to get mouse, are you on the first slot or the second one or the third or the fourth? So we're going to need this variable and I'll just set this up as a temporary variable. So as the cell including the X buffer. And remember we have to multiply that by the scaling factor, of course. All right, and the same for the Y. And we still have a bit more setup to do. So we've got the mouse position, we've got the slots themselves, but what we also want to do is get our mouse position not only relative to the GUI layer, but also relative to the inventory. So we don't really care about the mouse if it's not on the inventory itself. And remember, we're drawing the inventory itself. So we set up some variables right here, and these correspond to where we start drawing all the slots from. So we only really care about the mouse's position if it's larger than this. And in order to get what cell our mouse is in, we can deduct this value from our mouse's value and then just divide that remainder to get what slot we're in. So let's come back and we'll set up a few more temporary variables. So I'm going to call this the iMouse X. So iMouse X for the mouse's X position on the inventory slots. So just like I said, mouse X, and then we deduct the slot's position. So now we've kind of gotten rid of that upper left section of the GUI layer because we don't really care about that. And it's as if the mouse's position is now starting fresh and 0, 0 is now the top left corner of the slots. So if these values are larger than 0, then we know that the mouse is somewhere in this lower section. What we can do now is if we divide that number by the cells themselves, so this factor right here, because remember the cells are this size each in width, so if we divide our mouse's X position by that, then we're going to get a number between 0 and the number of slots that we have for the width of the inventory. So because there's 8 slots that we're currently drawing, so it's going to go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7, right? And then exactly the same for the Y value. So we need to get these values, and I'll just call this NX for number X. So instead of just straight up dividing the iMouse X position by the cell X buff, I'm actually going to use div because I want a whole number, right? I don't want to get so that we're in the slot 2.2, right? Because there is no slot 2.2, there's just slot 2. So if we use div just gets the number of times that a factor can be divided into another, so it doesn't have any remainder, which is exactly what we want. So we just use div, and then the same for the Y. All right, so this value has gotten kind of like the coordinates of the slot that we're in. So we have an X kind of coordinate, and then we have a Y coordinate, and that will give us the slot. So now what we need to actually do is, because our slots aren't really set up into a grid, they're just one long list, right? So they're just numbered from 0 up to however many inventory slots that we set. I think at the moment we had 17, so that would be 0 to 16. So we need to convert these X and Y coordinates to a number. So this is actually the values that we want for the variables that we set up here. So the mouse slot X and the mouse slot Y. So I'm going to set M slot equal to that. And I'm doing this on a separate line. I could have just made these directly equal to this here, but we're actually going to be adding a little bit more in a second between these 2 points. And I'll explain that in just a minute. But for now, this is fine. So we've gotten the mouse X coordinate and the mouse kind of Y slot coordinate. Now all we have to do is calculate the actual slot. So our selected slot itself, so is going to be equal to, so first the actual X coordinate itself, so because that's going kind of down the list as our X coordinate gets larger. But as we go up in the M slot Y, that's actually jumping a whole 8 slots. So we need to add M slot Y and then multiply that by the number of inventory slots that we have in the width. And we set that up as the variable M slots width, so we'll use this one here. Alright, and that will give us the slot that we're currently selecting. Alright, so that's it for the selecting. Now let's actually come into the draw event, and we'll make it so that if we're selecting a slot, let's make it look a little bit different. So let's just add kind of like a highlight to it. So here's where we were drawing the inventory slot, which was the part of the slot kind of on the back. So the slot itself. And then this right here was drawing the item itself. I'll keep this here, and we're going to draw the item differently if we are selecting it. So if we're not selecting it, it will do this, but if we are, then I'm going to draw it a little bit differently. So we're just going to go switch. And so what we're going to switch is the slot itself that we're currently on. So remember, our selected slot that we just set up, this is going to be a number from 0 to 16, or 0 to however many inventory slots that you had. So basically what we want is, right here, we're going to check if the current slot that we're on, which is going to be our II value, because remember, this is our incrementing factor that we're using to loop through the entire grid of our inventory slots. And it does this 17 times at the moment. So if we get to the point where II is equal to our selected slot, then we're going to draw it differently. So in the case that II is equal to our selected slot, then we're going to draw it in a special way. But otherwise, we're just going to have a default case that it's going to just draw it just as we had before. So I'm actually going to still draw it like this. So, and this is where you could get a little bit creative. I'm going to be a little bit boring and just draw something on top to make it look highlighted. So I'm actually going to draw it normally, but then after it's drawn it, I'm also going to draw the slot again on top of it. And you might be thinking, this is just going to cover it up, which is exactly what we would do if we left the code like that. But I'm actually going to change what's called the blend mode that we're using to draw this. So basically every time you draw something new to the screen, what GameMaker does is it's going to blend the picture that was there, everything that you've previously drawn, right? It's going to blend that thing with the new thing that you're drawing on top. And the thing that determines how much of the old picture that we keep and how much of the new picture that we keep is the blend mode itself. So by default, what it does is generally it just gets all of the new thing and it just discards all of the old thing. But what I'm going to tell it to do is keep all of the old thing and just add the new thing to it. And what this is going to do is just make everything a lot brighter. And to do this, we just use GPU set blend mode. So we're going to use the additive blend mode, right? So just as I said, so this adds the new picture to the old picture. And then afterwards, of course, we want to change it back to the normal one. And if you run the game right now, you'll see that this one is actually going to look extremely bright. So I'm not going to add the full image. I'm going to turn down the alpha of this a little bit to 0.3. So be sure and play around with that a little bit if you're not sure what it's doing. I also have a video that goes over using blend modes that you might be interested in. You could also just keep it really simple and just draw like a white rectangle over this area, but we'll just do it this way for fun. All right, so that should be it for the selecting. So let's run the game and see what that looks like. Okay, great. So we can see that wherever the mouse is hovering over, we get a new item being selected. Now there's a couple things that we're going to want to change about this. So for instance, if we come over to the spot in between two of them, you can kind of see that it counts the buffer here as the previous one, and you might not want it to take into account the buffer at all. So we're going to fix that. And we're also just going to optimize it a little bit and tell it to not do any of these calculations if it's gone outside of the bounds of the inventory, because you can see here that if you go outside it, it starts doing some pretty weird stuff. So we're going to tell it to not do any of this stuff if our mouse isn't here. All right, so let's come back to the step event. And here, what I'm going to do is, because we're saving it here in an instance variable, while these all get deleted as soon as this script runs, it's going to hold whatever mouse slot that we had from last time. So this is good. So we'll say that we'll only update this if we're in the bounds of the inventory. All right, and now I'm going to refer to these values here, because what we can just say is if nx is between 0 and the number of slots we have, so 0 to 7 for the horizontal component and between 0 and 2 for the y component, then we know we are indeed on the inventory slots. So we just say, so if nx, so if it's larger than or equal to 0, so that is the very start of the x that it can be, and if it's less than the inventory slots width, so less than 8, so this won't be including 8. So this is exactly what we want. We want it to be between 0 and 7, and the same for the y. All right, and then we just wrap this stuff in that condition. So we only update it if we're on the slots. And let's just give that a run and see if that worked. So it's still updating fine. And if we go off the board, it doesn't go all weird. All right, good. But you will notice that if we go off the board just like this after selecting something, so it's not updating it from what it was because it doesn't fulfill the requirements of that condition that we set. But if I come to that bottom row here, the selected slot kind of goes away. And that's because it is treating these slots as part of the inventory slots. I don't want that. I don't want it to update if I'm over a slot that I can't actually access. So there is one more thing that we have to add to this. So that if it calculates that we're on a selected slot that is larger than the current inventory slots that we specify. So remember we just set this to, well, I have it as 17 right now. So I'm actually going to say, take the minimum of either this value or inventory slots minus 1. So if this is less than 17 minus 1, which is 16, remember, because we're going from 0 to 16. So if this value is actually smaller than this one, then it will take this value here. So we're kind of setting the max at 16. So now if we run it, there we go. You can see that it's not updating if we come here. All right. Now finally, I'm just going to make it so that if we hover over the space between the inventory slots, that it doesn't update that either. It doesn't really make much of a difference for us, but if you have configured your inventory a bit differently and the buffer between the slots is actually quite large, it's going to look very strange when you hover the mouse over one of those areas and you actually get the slot selecting. So we're going to make it so that it doesn't do that. So in here, we're going to do something. So remember, our calculations are kind of treating the inventory slot itself and then plus the buffer. So each slot is kind of larger than it actually appears to the user. So what we want to do is say, well, if the mouse is in that slot and it's between the bounds of the slot itself and not the buffer, then we will update it. But if it's not, then we're not going to update it. So I'm going to set up two more variables. So SX and SY. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the iMouseX position. So this is the one that was kind of relative to the slots. So we're treating the upper left corner of the slots as our 0. So if this, and then minus all of the buffer space from that. So remember, because this value was kind of the rounded down version here, because we were using div, we were sort of going to be rounding down to the nearest slot that we're on. But for the mouse's actual X position, there's going to be a little bit more buffer room on top of that. So if we take away that rounded down value, we're just going to get the mouse's kind of raw position on that slot. And then we just have to check if it is less than the slot size, then we know that it is within the boundary of that item and it's not in any of the buffer space. And so we're going to do the same for the Y. And then here, another condition. So if it's less than the cell size, times the scale, of course. There we go, and then we just wrap that in that condition. Alright, so that should work now. Let's give that a go. Alright, perfect. So you can see it's not updating when we're in the buffer space between the slots. Okay, so finally, we've got the selecting of the items working, but let's make it so that we can pick up items and stack them on top of each other. So this will be playing around with the pickup item value that we set. And luckily, a lot of the hard work has been done for us because of this selecting stuff. So we already know what slot we're selecting. Actually, I might just wrap all of this in a region. Like that, so that we don't have to look at that code anymore. But we know that after all of those calculations, we ended up with a selected slot that we're on. So now what we have to do when we're picking it up is we kind of have to access that slot and see what is contained in there. So now we are doing the pickup item. So we're going to need access to our inventory grid. So again, I'm just going to make our inventory grid a local variable because we're going to be accessing it quite a few times in this step. So I'll just call it inventory grid. And now what we're going to do is get the actual item that we're selecting. So I'm going to call this selected slot item. So SS item. So we're going to get the actual item itself. So like what kind of item it is, if it's a tomato or a carrot or whatever. And we remember that the items types, they were stored in the 0 column of our inventory grid. And the Y component of each slot was denoting each new slot of the inventory. So we just need to get the slot that we're currently selecting, and then that will give us the actual item that we're holding. So there we go. So we're getting the selected slot item from the grid. And now I'm going to say so click the right mouse button, I'm going to pick up that item. But actually, I'm only going to do this if the item that we're picking up, so if the SS item slot, if that is not nothing. So we only want to pick it up if there's actually an item in that inventory slot. So we just check here first, does not equal our nothing item, because remember when we were declaring all of the item types, one of the constants in our enumerator was denoting that nothing item. There we go. So we just wrap that. So if our SS item is equal to something other than none, and we click the mouse right button, I'm going to set pickup item equal to the selected slot. All right, and let's come into the draw GUI event. And so just like with the selected slot case here, I'm also going to create a case for if II is equal to the item that we're currently picking up. So actually, maybe we shouldn't have called it pickup item, but pickup slot, because this isn't actually carrying the item itself, it's just the slot value of the item that we're picking up. So instead of going to all of the times I've referred to the pickup item and changing it to pickup slot, what you can do is just Control-Shift-F and then search for pickup item, and then we can replace every single time that we refer to this with a different value. So I'm going to change this to pickup slot. There we go. Because I think that makes more sense. Alright, so if the slot that we're currently on is equal to the pickup slot, and let's just grab this. So what I'm going to do is draw this. I'm going to just draw it at a lower alpha value. So I'm going to draw it at 0.2. But if you wanted, when you pick up the slot, for it to completely disappear from the slot, maybe you wouldn't want to do this at all. And then what I'm going to do is just draw the item wherever our mouse cursor is, so it kind of looks like we've picked it up and now it's kind of wherever the mouse is. And I have to do it down the bottom of here because I want this to draw on top of all of our slots. So we come down here, and so what we just say is if the pickup slot does not equal -1, which was the default value that we set it here. So this was meaning that there was nothing picked up. So if there's nothing there, it won't draw this stuff, but otherwise, we actually have a bunch of logic set up for getting the type of item in the inventory slots itself. This right here, so this was accessing the grid, the inventory grid, looking at the slot and then extracting what kind of item it was. And then it was finding where that item was positioned on our item sprite so that we could draw it using the draw sprite part. So I'm actually just going to grab this and plonk it in here, so that we can use just the same logic. And we will, again, grab this to draw the item. Put that in here. But instead of drawing it at the XX and YY, which was setting up where to draw it in a grid-like fashion, so remember we were incrementing these variables each time we were going through the loop. So instead of drawing it at some location like that, we just want to draw it at the mouse's position. And fairly easy, that's just mouse X and mouse Y. But instead of II, we are going to want pickup slot. So that will draw the item itself, but actually let's also draw the number on that item. So remember in our inventory grid, we were not only storing the item type, but we were also storing how much of that item that we had. And we were storing that one, the information for how many of the item that we had, that was in the second column of the grid, so in column 1. So we just need to access the item number from our inventory grid, so exactly the same. And same as before, so pickup slot. And then I'll just grab this for the item number. And then again, instead of XX and YY, we just get mouse X and mouse Y. All right. Oh, and then instead of the number string that we were drawing from here, I called it inum here, so we'll just change that. All right, and let's run the game. Okay, so we're currently not picking anything up, but if we right click, there we go. So we get the caret, and so the number is actually drawing there, but the mouse cursor is kind of in the way, and you can see it if you move it a little bit fast, like that. So you might want to draw it over or in the middle or something. So if we just add, for example, so half the width of the cell size, it should draw that number a little bit over. It looks a bit weird, but that is a bit better. We can see the number. All right, but this is just picking it up. We can't actually place it anywhere, so we can pick up whatever we want, but we need a way of actually putting it back down. So we need to come back to the step event and add some more logic. So this was for picking it up. So we know that we currently have an item picked up if our pickup slot does not equal -1. So we can just check. Then we go ahead and do this stuff. And actually we could just make this an else if you wanted to make it that once you pick something up, you have to decide what to do with it before picking up another one. All right, so remember the mouse right click was to pick something up, and we'll make the left click to put it back down. So we'll go, I might just copy this and change it to the left. All right, we're gonna need to do some different things depending on the slot that we want to put it down on. So say that we've picked something up, and then we are currently on a slot with nothing in it. Then that will just be adding the contents of what we're picking up to that new slot. But if this slot that we're currently on already has something on it, and say that we're picking up a tomato and we're trying to put it down on a carrot, we don't want to allow that to happen. But if, again, we're picking up some tomatoes and we are hovering over a slot with other tomatoes, then we want those items to stack on top of each other. So there's kind of 3 cases for what we're doing here. So the current item that we're on, so if that is equal, so remember this was like the type of item, so if it was a carrot or tomato or whatever, so if that is equal to none, then we will just add it to the slot. Else, if SS item, so the selected slot that we're on, is equal to the type of item that our pickup slot is currently holding, then we will stack them on top of each other. And then otherwise, so if we're not on a slot that has nothing and we're not on a slot that is the same type as us, then we are on a slot that has something in it, but it's not our type. All right, so let's do the easiest one first. Let's do the case if it has just nothing at all. So in this case, then we want to change the contents of the inventory grid to be our pickup item. So we go the slot of the inventory that we're currently selecting, let's change that. So that would be the type of item that's currently in that slot. Let's change it to be the type of item in the pickup slot. And we'll also want to change the number to be, we will want to set that to whatever the number of items in the picked up item that we are holding. All right, so we've changed the value of the selected slot, but now what we have to do is actually get rid of the entry from where we had picked it up, because now that item doesn't exist there anymore, we've moved it to this empty slot. So we'll just copy and paste this, but we'll change these values, and then instead of having them equal to something like this, we are setting them to be nothing, because now the old slot has nothing in it. So the number is 0, and then the type of item is none, which remember is actually just 0. Okay, and then finally what we have to do is remember our pickup slot variable. We have to change this back to be -1 so that we're no longer picking anything up. Okay, so that is the logic for if we're putting it down into a slot that has nothing in it. Now we'll do the one where if the slot that we're trying to put it down onto, if it's of the same type of the item that we're picking it up. So if we have a tomato and we're putting it down onto a tomato. Now, there's actually 2 things that could be going on here. So we could either be putting it back down onto the original slot that we had picked it up from, in which case we don't really have to do anything. We just have to turn off the fact that we're picking it up. But otherwise, if we're not putting it back down on the slot that we picked it up from, then we know that is a different tomato slot and we'll want to be stacking the items together. So let's just check for that first. So if the selected slot that we're on is not equal to the slot where we picked up the tomato in the first place, then we know that it's a different slot. Otherwise, we're not going to do anything that we do in here. We're just going to change that to -1. All right. So for this case, we know that we're putting it down onto a different tomato slot. We don't actually have to do this. We don't have to change the item type, but we do have to change the item number, and we do have to set the original slot to 0 as well. So we'll grab these and put them in here. But instead of making the selected slot equal the contents, the number of things that we had in the pickup slot, we are going to add them together because we're stacking the items. So we just put plus equals. All right. So we're done for that one. And now finally, this will be the case for when we're trying to put down the item that we have picked up, but the slot is of a type that is not nothing and it's not our own type. So we're trying to put down a tomato onto like a carrot. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down the item that we're currently picking up, and we're going to pick up the item that is currently there. So we're going to do a swap. So to do this, we're going to have mostly the same kind of logic as before. So we'll grab all of this and put it here. So this is fine. We're still going to be replacing the selected slot with the item that we're picking up. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually swap the content. So I'm going to put this one back in here. And now we have to actually first, before we set this, we have to make sure that we're saving the contents of this and this so that we can put it here and here. Luckily, we already actually have this value because it's going to be this one right here. So we can use that one. But we haven't grabbed the number. So before we set it, we have to save it. So I'm going to put var SS item num. Like that, so we're just saving the number first. And then we can make it equal it here. All right. And now finally, you may or may not want this. So as it is, if we do the swap, we'll be picking up the tomato, putting it down on the carrot, and the carrot will just pop back to where the tomato was. So that's the current logic of what we're doing, because after we do all this, we're turning off the item that we're selecting. But if you want, you can get rid of this line. And then what will happen instead is that you'll put the tomato down and the carrot contents will go to where the tomato was, but you'll actually pick up that carrot. So I'll show you what that looks like. So we'll just run the game. Everything should be set up. There we go. So let's pick up a tomato and we'll put it down onto a potato. So you can see I kind of pick up the potato. And let's just test all of our cases. So we can put down the bucket back where it was. Let's try and pick up an axe and then stack it onto another axe. There we go, so that works. And let's try and put it onto a slot that we don't already have. Okay, good. It shouldn't be allowed to do that. So you can see it's just getting kind of like the highest value that it can. And if we put it out here, yep, that's working fine. All right, so we are done with today's video. I'd like to thank everyone on Patreon who are supporting me to create these tutorials. And a special shout out to Danielle Hargrave, Max Molinaro, Stuart Wells, Uthelian, The Great Poultry, XD Game Studio, Monju72, and Hunter T. Thanks for watching guys, I hope you're well, and I'll see you next time.